Nicht ganz, sondern nur ein bisschen. So. So. Warte mal.
Okay. Ich würde mich nicht... Na gut.
It's okay.
Mr. Koolhaas, I'm very pleased that I'm here and that we met and that we can talk a little bit about, I think, rather difficult issues like a theory of architecture, articulations of architecture, elements of architecture. But perhaps we should start by presenting ourselves to the public and ask some rather simple questions like, why did you become an architect at all?
There's a kind of very boring explanation. My grandfather was an architect. He made corporate headquarters for KLM and for Shell. And he was not quite a modernist, but also not a conservative architect. My father was a writer, and my mother was a stage designer. And when I was 18, I became a journalist and a scriptwriter. And that was really to avoid becoming an architect. Because I was always really interested in being an architect. When I was 14, I wanted to become a Brazilian architect. And then when I was 24, I had to present movies to an audience of architects, and they all wanted to become movie makers, and I decided to become an architect. And in any case, I think that the two professions, scriptwriting and architecture, are very close, because for both you have to consider a plot, you have to develop episodes, and you have to create a kind of montage that makes it interesting, and a sequence that makes the circulation or the path through a building or the experience of a building interesting, and that gives a certain suspense. So I've always felt that there is very little kind of difference between the two, and also I still have a certain difficulty in admitting completely that I'm an architect, because I consider that writing is at least as important as building.
So you are blurring the distinctions a little bit, but you are interested in the specifics of the distinction, of the sides of the distinction as well. You know very well when you are writing or when you are searching for some architecture.
You know incredibly well when you're writing, because when you're writing you're alone. And as you can see here, in architecture you're never alone.
Yeah.
And that is a kind of fantastic difference, and that's why it is also interesting to use one against the other. Because at some point it could really become very easy to forget who you are, because you're always working in kind of collective environments, which is actually very good, because you can, in the best cases, generate a kind of collective intelligence. But it means that you don't always know where you begin and where you stop.
I see.
And in writing you always do that.
Let me tell you how I got interested in architecture. I always was interested in social theory. I read Adorno and I read Marx, and I knew from the beginning of my studies that I had to become a kind of sociologist or economist or whatever. But I grew up in a family consisting mostly of architects. My father is an architect, my two sisters are architects, and somehow at some point my father became a town planner and started to be interested in complexity of architecture. And I always knew that I would never kind of draw a building. I just don't know how to draw, whatever. But I was fascinated by him talking about the complexity of a town, consisting of order, consisting of structure, consisting of chaos, consisting of dysfunctions, where he had always the duty to look for some structure in order to let the people do what they want to do. Structure enabling others to do destructural or dysfunctional things. And this was an approach to complexity which I found is very similar to what social theory is about. And then I looked at what he did and started to write little pieces about architecture. And this was exactly the way how I finally found out about you and read your papers and articles and books, and looked at your architecture and saw some weeks ago this wonderful exposition content, which was presented in Berlin and now it's presented in Rotterdam, and perhaps to draw these 2 points of theory on the one side and architecture or writing and building on the other side together. We could talk a little bit, if you like, talk a little bit about your idea of patent office. Yeah, there's a big wall in this exposition content which is called the patent office, a modernization project. There's in big letters written about. What is this about?
Well, there's a number. I'm a skeptic, and already in your summation there are many things I'm skeptical about. And I have a question, but maybe we can talk about it later, whether you entirely believe that your father was actually doing what he told you he was doing. But anyway, and I'm also a skeptic about whether there really exists an architectural theory and whether it is not simply kind of different architectural narratives. But
I think we agree.
Yeah, but this patent thing is it's partly a joke and partly not a joke. What I wanted to do is several things. Kind of first of all, we have been kind of very fertile in making certain inventions. At the same time, I'm very modest in the sense that it's very hard to identify what is in architecture an invention. Because I think the vast majority of architecture is just kind of formal manipulation, and inventions almost never take place. But if you kind of look carefully at where our greatest effort has been kind of invested and where our greatest maybe originality is that we did to the section what in the previous part has been done to the plan. In other words, because I read about your article about the destruction of the box. I mean, that's a kind of, and I think that you can encapsulate everything that we did in a way as kind of work on a section in some form. So simply, the patterns are a way of kind of recording in a kind of incredible surf of newness and incredible waves of simulation, but also imitation. Some kind of precise claims at finding out certain things before before that. Because I think that we live in a time almost without memory. Which is kind of very inconvenient for architecture, to produce architecture, but also to look at architecture. So it's kind of basically to insist on a certain memory of it, and at the same time, it is also a kind of irony that architecture seems, although we now live in the kind of during the apotheosis of the market economy, almost the only profession that is not benefiting from the market economy. In other words, if you invent in almost any other domain, kind of even science now, or literature, or script writing, or popular song, or violin playing, anywhere there is a kind of a certain relationship between your income and your originality, and in architecture it's zero.
No intellectual property.
No intellectual property, and so it's it's more kind of wishful thinking. And kind of how rich we could have been if it had been there. And that is why we started this other office, AMO, because we have the hope that we can escape from the kind of hopelessly old-fashioned architectural economy into to participate in an other economy. But so far it's really a utopian.
I'm very convinced of this idea to present both a memory and a sort of intellectual capital in architecture. What I was struck by these patent office pictures because there is also some kind of deep and very precise theoretical thinking hidden in these patterns. I agree that there is no theory of architecture, but I think nevertheless that it is possible to analyze the very basic elements architecture always exists of. I agree almost nobody did this until this day, but I think it's possible, and I think that your patent office pieces went a long way to do this. Let me just take one example. The inertness modified is one of the pieces, 1997, where you look for solutions of the problem that in all buildings you have to be both unspecific, people wandering around and looking for something to do and some place to stay and some other place to go then. But you have to be specific as well, because there have to be reasons that people attract were some part of the space and expel them from some other part. So every building has to be unspecific and specific
at the same time.
And of course then you start looking for the theory or the structural elements of architecture, because this unspecificity and specificity has to be linked. There has to be articulation. And I think if we would succeed in looking for the articulation of distinctions in buildings, then we would end up with some kind of theory of architecture.
But I'm kind of very happy to contribute it as a kind of passive passive partner. The point is, I think that it's interesting that you're right about talk about your father's notion of complexity, because I think that your father's generation, or that generation, kind of, which probably also includes kind of Unger's, Team 10, the Smithsons,
now the 70s,
they're incredibly fascinating because they did so many things incredibly intelligently and had so many really great ideas. I was always another way of creating kind of synthesis of our whole work is to try to find a way, exactly as you're saying, that things can be indeterminate, and because indeterminacy was the kind of big 60s thing, and yet have an identity, or yet have a form, or yet be kind of somehow at the same time not open-ended. And that is, almost every one of our projects starts with that kind of realization that that nothing can be kind of entirely predicted, but that kind of certain structures can be kind of engineered and give a shape to something, because without shape there is nothing kind of eventually to react to. So I think it's a very true.
So it's complexity and shape
as almost contradictory, but I mean basically through indeterminacy and specificity.
There's some definition of complexity developed in the 40s, which says that a complex object is an object which surtaxes an observer. If an observer is stupefied, overtaxed.
But I think that's a typical 60s kind of complexity. But I think that what you're basically challenged by that, I think that we also. And I think that's a kind of very personal motivation, kind of occasionally succeeded in doing things of a stupefying simplicity. For instance, the house in Bordeaux where, I don't know whether you know this story.
No.
Okay. In Bordeaux, I was asked to do a house for a family, and the husband of the family was handicapped and in a wheelchair. And it took us a long time to kind of really unlock how to do that, because he wanted a house that in no way reminded him of his handicapped situation. And he also didn't want the typical handicapped house, which is a kind of house which is much more simple than typical, that has no thresholds, no corners, etc. He wanted, on the contrary, a house that contained the complexity of the world. And it took us a long time that we for ourselves, and this is actually also how the office works, that almost any kind of architectural breakthrough is first defined in words, and in a verbal formula that then kind of unlocks the more formal kind of solution. Although I hate the word solution, but anyway, it took us a long time to understand that we could do a house that was not a compensation for his inabilities, but an extension of his remaining abilities. And what we did, we had a house 3 levels, and we designed for him a position, a room, but that room was also an hydraulic elevator, and that moved basically independently through the house and past a wall made out of glass that contained everything that he needed, from clothes to books to wine.
It's stacked freedoms.
Yeah. And so that one was kind of in a way very simple. I don't think there was any complexity in the traditional terms for it. Maybe the idea had a certain complexity. And what was also exciting is, of course, that his movements actually changed the nature of the house all the time and the nature of the architecture. So I've always been alarmed by the term complexity, prefer indeterminacy, and also have been challenged to find very, very simple answers to very complex issues.
Yeah. I agree completely. I would look for mechanisms right now. Yeah. I started with complexity, but I'm now deep in the search for mechanisms, and I think it should be for a theorist. It should indeed be possible to call out for mechanisms of different kind for all things we have: a mechanism of theater, a mechanism of architecture, a mechanism of sociology, and so on. And maybe one possible mechanism of architecture consists in that distinction between private and public, or inside and outside, or upside and downside, and the articulation of these distinctions is the mechanism which makes up for a building. And I think in this pattern, which you called, I think, stacked freedom for this house in Bordeaux, you found a mechanism which both accepts a traditional house and turns it upside down for a very specific, a very special situation.
But I think that was actually kind of really the reason to write those patterns. That they're all mechanisms, they're all machines in that sense.
But you wouldn't try to look for some basic or some elementary mechanism in architecture. I ask this because I never met an architect who would go into answering a question if there are one mechanism. Which is, of course, a very, very silly question as theorists ask.
Well, I certainly have a nostalgia for one question. And one of my reasons of the endless preoccupation with Mies van der Rohe is exactly that how somebody could find the same answer to every issue. And you could say that the box of Mies is kind of single universal answer. And I think that in the 80s and 90s there has been so almost nauseating kind of quantities of specificity made even more special or kind of more unique by the action of the architecture, because in a way every more serious performance was taken away from him through the market economy. That becomes a very kind of compelling effort. But I don't think we can do it.
If we go, for example, for the notion of complexity developed at Santa Fe Institute in the 90s, they are very much interested in looking for mathematical equations consisting of just one mechanism repeated recurrently and iterated over and over again, and producing a surface which is for all observer a chaotic, a very rich surface. Then you have these two sides of a chaotic surface and a simple mechanism producing it, which is called a fractal as well. If I phrase my theoretical question in these terms and ask whether you would think that there is a fractal identity in architecture, one mechanism producing all the different surfaces, we see and we accept as being different and love as being different. What would you say to this kind of phrasing the question?
I'm definitely. I'm not kind of professional enough in a certain way to kind of really give a yes or no, but I have a very strong instinctive revulsion of it or skepticism of it. But I have a very good friend who's my engineer. His name is Cecil Beaumont. Have you ever?
No.
You should read, and maybe I can give you the books because he is kind of really working on those things. So when I say I don't really think so, I'm in a sort of way lying, because our work is in its best cases an incredibly intimate collaboration with and also dependent on the work of engineering, which actually kind of deals with all those issues in a very precise way. And I know Cecil has written about kind of fractal and he's from Sri Lanka. I think that makes a big difference also. We both have a kind of feeling of not producing Western architecture. But I think it works well in terms of surfaces, but not really well in everything else that architecture is.
Okay.
So it, you know, for instance, in a certain building of Libeskind, he's kind of developed a fractal tiling kind of system, and so I can see how it works for certain things, but at the same time, it seems a kind of laborious way of outwitting culture, which is happening at an enormous extent in architecture today, and I don't see why you would want to disconnect or uncouple from culture.
Okay. It's interesting that we are talking about architecture which without using notions like space or function, which are very old and cherished notion, and everybody talking about architecture used some kind of these notions. Are you using them still?
Well, I never used the word space ever, and it's only recently that I would grudgingly admit that it is an issue, and I always replace the word function with script in a certain way, but of course we are incredibly interested in function. I mean, our best work is not good because any abstract qualities, but simply because we engaged, for instance, as we're engaging now, the process of television making, but also the whole issue of media and China. So that maybe function is a kind of naive term for it, but it's certainly what it is critical in terms of what inspires us and what we like to work on. Space, I thought, was one of the kind of most kind of repulsive mystifications of architecture and legitimations of architecture, because everyone used it as a kind of sacred and a secret, which no one else could be, which excluded everybody else. And so I've always been deeply skeptical of it, but since we now work in architecture but also not in architecture, I find it slightly less embarrassing to admit that we are also creating spaces sometimes. And sometimes I'm even overwhelmed by the amount and the quantity we generate, and slightly nauseating.
It's very, very interesting. I think that function, the notion of function, fell prey to critical theory. Yeah? As soon as you spelled out a function of whatever, you thought you were a servant to some capitalist functioning of the society. So you weren't meant to do anything what was functional. Whereas space right now is some, you say sacred, some kind of resource of reality. Yeah, people tired of theory, of postmodern theory, are now rediscovering space and think that's what is out there, space. Yeah. And it's very, very discomforting for me, because that space, of course, doesn't exist. It's just an imagination of somebody. I like very much the notion of space developed by Martin Heidegger 40, 50 years ago, where he said that space is the combination of direction and approaching or nearness. Yeah. Nähe und Entfernung versus Richtung and Endrichtung. There is no space as such, but there is always a space being created by people approaching each other or withdrawing themselves from each other and directing them this way or that way. And as soon as somebody is just changing the direction of his eyes, the space is a different one. And that's what is interesting. And that is, I think, what is interesting for architecture as well, because you are the masters of directing regards, Blicke.
Yeah, I feel more that it's like choreography more than directing Blicke, but directing bodies. It is more about bodies, I think, but certainly not about directing. I mean, I think that one of the exciting things about architecture is that it gives you so many reasons to be modest. Because there are so many levels on which you can fail, and so many certainties of failure, and that has been and ironically also in the current economic system you cannot admit to failure because it's kind of dishonorable, or it interferes with your or your value. But
only admit the mistakes you learn something from.
Not even that. You cannot admit any mistake.
Möchten Sie, dass wir Deutsch reden?
Nein, nicht wir, aber wenn Sie einen Monolog haben, warum nicht in Deutsch?
Monolog lieber in Englisch, bleibt die Kürze. The question, one question addressed to us, posed to us, is the question whether being you an architect and me a theoretician, we ever learned something. So it changed our thinking about our subjects, which is a very nice question, which should make us very modest, once again. I think that for me, indeed, there has been a moment where I learned something which happened in the 90s, reading the writings and looking at the buildings done by Frank Lloyd Wright, who evidently did his work in the 40s and 30s of the last century, but a kind of work which I thought at this time goes very exactly in the same direction like deconstruction went in the 80s, Jacques Derrida and other peoples. What I learned then was that architecture, which I thought is some kind of handicraft, architecture, even done by doing buildings, not only by doing writings about buildings or some other kind of writings, architecture is a handicraft which is able to reflect on itself. And reflect on itself in a way that observers see this seems to be a building, but somehow it isn't a building. Or it is a building, but somehow it tries to destroy its very aspect of being a building. Frank Lloyd Wright's expression for this was the destruction of the box. His idea that any building which is able to show its own architecture should be a building where inside and outside are flowing into each other. The distinction between inside and outside is blurred while still showing the distinction. It's not destroyed, it's just blurred. And he did these wonderful houses where the landscape by the means of fountains or by the means of swimming pools went inside the house, and the very floor of the house, Holzparkett, went outside to the terrace of the house, of the porch of the house. So we had an inside and outside blurring, which consists not only in the floor but in the shaping of the wall, the shaping of the ceiling as well. And this, for me, was the moment when I learned something about architecture, which I took at this time could only be done by theory, and where I started by learning something about architecture where I started to take theory as a kind of praxis in itself, and where this discovery changed my own way of doing sociology, because from this time on, I started to do sociology as a way to get to talk to people, and not only to do my writing and have some colleagues reading it and then knowing something about the strange discipline called sociology. So
But to talk to people in what way? Like we are doing now?
We are doing right now in consulting business, for instance. But as well, I try to write not very successfully, I have to admit, I try to write my articles in a way such that they can be read by the people in the practice.
Make it more accessible.
Yeah, more accessible. And I try to realize a combination of accessibility and stupefaction. Because I shouldn't just say yes to what people is doing, but I should show them what they are doing in a way they never saw it before, and then letting them start to think differently about it. Yeah.
And how do you account for the fact that this revelation was triggered by a kind of way of thinking that was 100 years old?
I'm sorry, I had to...
How do you account for the fact that this revelation was triggered by some thinking that was 100 years old? Because Frank Lloyd Wright actually started much earlier than the 30s and 40s. I mean, it was
That's right,
1907, kind of, really almost 100 years
Okay,
ago.
yeah. Well, that only strengthens my point, because the beginning of the 20th century was so rich in thinking about the 20th century. Think only about Carl Einstein and his history of the art of the 20th century, written in 1913, 1914, something like that. I think if I got it wrong, the dates concerning Frank Lloyd Wright, I'm only happy to hear that he was earlier, and to learn that once again, beginning of 20th century, like Georg Simmel and others, was very rich in structural theory, structural thinking about our times.
Yeah, but also very rich in theory, in untheoretical outpourings of experimentation. I think that because that must be somehow what you're responding to in a way. Well, one of the beautiful things about architecture is, of course, that no matter how pretentious or unpretentious it is always used. There is no architecture that is inaccessible in that way. And in that sense, it has a kind of very unique status, I think, because books can be inaccessible, music can be inaccessible, plays can be inaccessible, but architecture cannot be inaccessible. So, in a certain way, it is a very privileged medium, and that it has use, which I think is, for me, for instance, one of the last connections to morality. And which probably was a very important incentive in terms of kind of making, small as it was, the shift from script writing to architecture. But I was reading your thing about the books yesterday, or about architecture, and in a way I was surprised, because it is a story that is true of a kind of pre-modern age. And if you look, for instance, in your theory of inside and outside, I think there is an enormous amount of architecture today, and has been around maybe since the middle of the 19th century, where outside is simply so far removed that it will never be an exchange, or if there is an exchange, it only occurs at the surface but not at the core. And I think,
like, for instance?
Well, I think that, for instance, in a kind of a certain department store, you cannot have a communication between something that is literally kind of 50 meters deep, and that has actually kind of been my major preoccupation. Also, that architecture which is not part of the canon in terms of thinking, which I really found mostly in America, and that is one of the unique things about America, that there is, where Europe thinks and writes manifestos, but usually doesn't create any evidence, that America is a kind of enormous amount of evidence without manifesto, and so that was for me the exciting thing of looking at New York and actually discovering things, and I think that, you know, by looking first and then working, all those discoveries are now what stimulate us. But I think that if you look at department stores, shopping centers, skyscrapers, they simply have the issue of outside is really fundamentally a non-issue, I would say.
I'm not so convinced of this antithesis. I just cannot imagine anybody going to a gigantic shopping mall and spending perhaps a whole day or even 2 days with some hotel in between in the shopping mall, not knowing that someday he will have to leave it, and someday he will have to, some hour he will have to go out and to replenish his portemonnaie in order to buy once again in the shopping mall. So it's not a closed world. People is admiring or is loving shopping malls as if they were closed worlds and as if they were protected from everything which is which they don't like outside of the shopping malls. But they know there is this world outside, and they know why they are inside. Just to
But I would say that increasingly the outside is also becoming more and more artificial. And I think that there's a kind of enormous kind of amount of professionals that kind of make that are dedicated to removing authenticity and turning it into public space.
I don't have any problem with that.
Yeah, no, but I think that
I don't think that the outside is nature.
No, I realize that. No, really, but it used to be, of course, not nature, but anyway, another condition or the public realm. But I think what we have now is really a unique situation that the inside is completely manipulated, but the outside is also completely manipulated, not for different purposes, but for the same purpose, to make it kind of like eventful, to make it tasteful, to remove danger, to create comfort, and I think that is a process that has been going on for a long time. So that, for instance, certain new parts of Tokyo are really you cannot distinguish anymore whether you're inside or and it doesn't matter. It's all the same frantic kind of reassurance.
What you're saying about the outside in Tokyo is a wonderful example for what I would like to say as well, which is that the outside doesn't have any natural or evident or what have you side to it, but it's as shaped and as formed at the inside as well. But still, you have to distinguish these two functional terms, let's say, outside and inside, because the inside always has this, for me, has this connotation of specificity. You do something special in some inside, you're sleeping or cooking or whatever. And the outside is a space, a place where you can switch.
Indeterminate.
Indeterminate is where you can use.
But I think that is exactly my point. The indeterminacy of the outside is all being eroded and being replaced by endless specificity, by chains of specificity, where kind of really the choice and the kind of randomness that, because I agree with you that is the virtue of the outside, that there's a less suffocating kind of logic operating. But now it has become equally suffocating. From on the one hand the timetable of the train or the plane, but now it's increasingly the kind of relentless aestheticization of it.
But there's one point left.
Which is?
The one point is that you have to be able somewhere to switch between specificities. Just to go from one specificity to one other specificity. And this space or this
well, how many different specificities would you say you've experienced today?
Today?
I would argue very few, because everything was
4, 6
in one trajectory and one aim. It was hard to achieve. You probably had to go from country to country. I think that everything you did was geared to that.
Well,
in a kind of very patterned.
I
I
had to check out in my hotel. I had to look some places in Rotterdam. I had to look at the harbor in Rotterdam. I had to go for some tea, and I always knew I had to buy some daily stuff. I always knew what I wanted to do. I always knew that I had to stop doing what I'm doing, and then searching for some space where I can go in order to switch for the next thing I wanted to do. Yeah. So there is some kind of platform, some kind of indeterminate area where I'm just standing for a second and asking myself, what could you do now? And where nothing answers these questions, save myself going for a new aim, for a new purpose, and searching for some new specificity. And I just would like, in a very abstract and sociological way, to call these moments, these events, these states of indeterminateness outside or even public, switching areas.
So what do you think? Do you think the public is still intact? I mean,
Intact? So what is it?
well, maybe not intact, but there. What is your? You don't think that the kind of economy of the last 15 years has drastically kind of changed a number of terms to the point?
There is certainly some change in the economy the last 15 years, but a change in public I wouldn't see. There's still lots of people going to some markets, debating each other. There's still lots of mass media simulating this kind of debate of people among each other. There is still surprise in opinion production, which is a very, very definite function of public spaces or publicity. So I see that there are things changing, but I don't see the dramatic or even fundamental change.
Maybe, of course, there's a kind of fundamental difference between you and me, which is that you can think independently and that I can only think as a tool of others or as an extension of others. In terms, I need clients because without clients,
I need readers.
We are not there.
I need readers.
But that's not at all the same.
Okay.
Because you are not working for your readers.
That's true.
You don't follow an initiative which is defined by your readers, in an ambition that is defined by your readers, and you're not paid by your readers, except very indirectly.
Only sometimes.
Yes, and so we have a kind of, and that is a really colossal difference.
Yeah.
And I think that you probably still are supported by some kind of public body, if you're connected to a university.
A private university.
Yeah, a private university. But anyway, but we have in our profession, the economy has kind of really almost severed all ties to what was public. We don't work for nations anymore, not for cities, we work for private people or private corporations, and so our connection with the public good is formally severed. And so to the extent that we're good, we're only good because we want to be good or because we're afraid to be bad. And so that is one how we started the conversation, that we are in a very cool situation because on the one hand we have not benefited from the economy. On the other hand, we have suffered because our status has become completely changed because we are no longer part of a public body. And that's a pretty drastic kind of double wrenching movement.
I see. What about the activities of AMO? You talked about working for the European Commission, thinking about some.
Yeah. So with AMO, so the irony of an architect is that he or she cannot define their own agenda. You can have a whole series of preoccupations, kind of interest, competences, etc., but you have no control over kind of any sequence in which it will be developed or unfolded or applied. And so that became a kind of very deeply unsatisfying kind of situation, and that's why I started to teach at Harvard and start AMO, because at least now we can occasionally for instance, through this switch, I could look at Legos, which in any other condition I could never do. And so we now have a kind of very minimal dimension of independence, but it's very weak in a certain way, because still we need to make money and we need to. But it enabled us, for instance, to decide to work for the European community, or to work in Russia for the Hermitage, or to work in Beijing on the issue of preservation. Those are all things that we had to kind of do on our own initiative in a certain way.
Wouldn't you say that you are doing some kind of state lobbying by this work, and that you are able in some way to define how some architecture will be done as soon as Russia at the Hermitage or Brussels with the EU defines new projects and is able to give new orders to architects? So it's a private-public partnership you are looking at?
I don't think so, because I think that you have no idea how, like Brussels has no money, first of all, and kind of they live in an environment over which they have had no influence. And that is kind of one of the paradoxes of the European situation, that the continent that invented democracy is living in kind of borrowed identities defined by Belgian developers. And so I'm not possible. I think that clearly there is something slightly different going on in the kind of economic situation, maybe in now and maybe in the near future, but that I do not believe that this patronage will ever come back in the. So we have to be kind of incredibly ingenious about inscribing us in things that to which we're actually not invited. So it's in that kind of sense surreptitious.
Maybe that's just a turn of the history which goes back to normal, because this democratic state of the state is just 200 years old, and it's a way to link a very, very sophisticated military machine, the machine of the modern army, with some democratic mechanism to say yes to these military machines. And this is abolished right now. And there are new military machines set up in the Near East and in the Far West as well. And we have to look, and the European Commission is not very apt to this right now, I think, as well. We have to look for new kinds to define the state and to something with the state and to do other things without the state. And that's a very difficult situation. I agree to this.
Yeah. But it's also very unfair to ask the European Commission to do it, because they are bureaucrats and not thinkers.
They are proud of their civil service tradition, fleshing it out as any new moment.
Do you think about politics also?
Yeah.
What is your political work, and how do you work in politics?
Writing papers, of course. I have to admit that I started to think about politics only 1 or 2 years ago, and I didn't do it. And
didn't do it before.
Yeah, I didn't do it before. And almost nobody did it before in my entourage.
Circle.
Because in West Germany, there was no necessity to think about politics. The Americans did this for us, or the Russians did it for the eastern part of Germany. And now we start to have to do it for ourselves once again, and we are reading lots of political theory which either exists in the state of idealized civil society thinking, or in a very sophisticated late Marxian state, exemplified by Charles Tilly, the sociologist from Columbia University in New York, for instance, who is exactly one of those who redraws the picture of the politics as consisting of a military machine making agreeable or made comfortable with the public, with the population surrounding it. I think it's necessary to rethink politics in terms of a management of the possibility of violence.
Mhm.
And if we do this, we end up asking a lot of very interesting questions. If we don't do this, if we don't dare to think the handling of violence, we could
It's the key,
just
yeah.
drop thinking about politics.
Mhm.
That's the way I think.
And could you speculate what it implies for architecture?
I think it dramatizes some very, very traditional, very nice questions about architecture, phrased in terms like openness and closure.
You know that kind of when I was a student, I did a study of the Berlin Wall.
Tell about it. Yeah.
As students, we all had to go and do a documentary of a nice building, and most people would go to kind of Greek island, and I went to the Berlin Wall to document the Berlin Wall. This was in 72, 71, or 70. So it was just not so long there, just celebrating its first decade.
Years, yeah.
And so, and I was studying in the 60s, so that was in a kind of very countercultural flower power condition where everyone was convinced that architecture would liberate and could be a form of liberation. And so I basically went there to assert or to see architecture, stare architecture in the face, and realize that it had an inevitable element of violence and an inevitable kind of fundamental performance of exclusion and inclusion. A project we did then was called the Voluntary Prisoners of Architecture, and it really remains a very kind of important part of our convictions. That there is a fundamentally deeply nasty part of architecture that is mobilized in those contexts. But it's not something that gets talked about a lot.
Bist du halt?
Can you now let me? Well, no, just leave it. Just leave it.
Okay.
Yeah, just leave it.